We can be seekers for 60 years, indefinitely, if a certain change doesn't happen. What I mean by that is that there is a very important change that needs to happen in order for real change to happen. If life doesn't work on that particular change, we will continue to be seeking answers through thought, through trying to engage in the detail. So the change that needs to happen is a change whereby our functioning is not concerned about detail, is not looking for answers in circumstance. So as long as we're looking for answers in something that we affect, then the same dynamic that actually is the problem continues to persist. That means that if the system is convinced that the answer is an answer I have to bring about by doing something, thinking will be continually engaged, because it's through thinking that we bring about an outcome on the circumstantial level. And there needs to be a reason for that thinking to stop. Life needs to bring about sufficient change in that area where we stop thinking, which really means stop functioning a certain way. We don't fix life. Actually, that's it. Lunchtime. We don't fix life. We don't fix ourselves. Happiness doesn't come from fixing life. Happiness doesn't come from fixing ourselves. It's that very movement which life has habituated into place of fixing, of finding a solution in changing, that is the very obstacle. So hopefully, a part of us can see when that kicks in, can see when that type of thinking kicks in. And if it's hit home that our happiness isn't to be found in fixing things, when that thinking is seen, an automatic thought can just arise, and the thought says, stop. Stop trying to fix things. Stop seeking your happiness in outcomes. So it maybe can become clear that that stop is a natural intelligence coming from the body, coming from the intellect. The stop just says stop. Stop trying to find the solution through a functioning that will never give you the solution. Until that becomes deeply believed, understood, not just believed, but really seen for oneself, that movement to fix things actually, when we really look at it objectively, is in itself part of what we're trying to fix. It is an uncomfortableness. And ironically, the solution is in us stopping trying to find a solution. So that really needs to be understood, which means when the other movement happens, the movement of getting involved in circumstance and in outcomes and what is happening, thinking that that's where the solution will come from. And that's going to kick in from time to time because it's a deeply ingrained habit. But hopefully, when it kicks in, another part of us recognizes that as the problem. Whereas in the past, there was nothing inside of us that recognized it as a problem. And so it kept being taken to be the solution. And so we kept digging that hole, thinking that that is the movement that will one day solve the problem. And in fact, it was a movement that was doing the very opposite to solving the problem. So this is the change that I started off talking about, the change that life has to bring about. And if life doesn't bring this particular change about, this particular change in functioning about, we will approach seeking in the same way that we have approached any other task in life, and approach it through doing and through applying thinking. And that functioning keeps us disconnected from our being. And the answer to what we're really looking for is in our being. So an analogy can be if we're on a treadmill running, thinking that the running, if I clock up enough miles on the treadmill, I'm going to get where I need to go. And actually where we need to go is, let's say, is sitting on a chair. And what we're doing is we're running, which is the opposite of sitting on a chair, thinking that the running is going to get us somewhere. And in this analogy, the solution, or where we want to go, is the chair. So it requires us to stop running on the treadmill to be on the chair. And in life, what we're really looking for is connection to ourself, to our being. That's the solution. That's where we find what we've always been looking for, in our own being. And thinking about the solution is the equivalent of running on the treadmill. Just being is the equivalent of sitting on the chair. So if you find yourself thinking about how to be happy, maybe you'll be able to see it as you running on the treadmill, which is the opposite of what you're really looking for, which is resting on the chair. If you believe deeply inside that the solution is in running on the treadmill, you're going to keep running. It would make no sense to get off the treadmill and sit on the chair. So what hopefully this discussion is, this talk is life ingraining in us that happiness is not to be found where we think it's to be found. That can give us the motivation, the reason to step off the treadmill and sit in the chair. So if you find yourself concerned about being successful in business, if you're doing that because you think it will make you happy, then know that that is running on the treadmill, believing that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. If you're waiting for your soulmate, and you're doing it because you think it will bring you happiness, then know that that is running on the treadmill. If you think that you need to be socially acceptable because that will make you happy, then know that that's running on the treadmill. All of these mental movements are keeping us disconnected from our being, where the real solution is to be found. So that's just a pointer that at any point in the day when you see yourself completely focused mentally on a particular circumstance and how to improve it, and thinking about what's missing and wouldn't it be nice if we had this, when we will realize, oh, that's me looking for my happiness and outcomes. It's innocent. It's happening because that's how life has programmed us to function. So life has programmed us deeply to believe that our happiness will be found when life finally delivers the perfect mix of external factors. And while we're programmed that way, we are going to feel uncomfortable. Because essentially it's a false belief about who I am, a false belief about who I am and what I need. Of course we're going to be uncomfortable if we have a false idea about ourselves. How can that be comfortable? Comfortableness is the collapse of the false idea of myself, the false self-image. That collapse of the false self-image means that, I don't need life to look a certain way. I don't need to function a certain way in order to be valid, in order to be complete. It means, what does it mean? It means we can relax, maybe for the first time in our life. Except when we were a baby. We were relaxed then, because we didn't have that ingrained belief. And as these beliefs collapse, if you recognize in a moment, I'm convinced that I need to be, kind, I need to help people, I need to not get angry, I need to fit in, I need to see these places in the world. And then we realize this is a whole list of shoulds and shouldn'ts that are extra baggage that we're carrying around. And when we realize this, sometimes we rebel against shoulds and shouldn'ts. If we realize that the shoulds and shouldn'ts that we thought were actually going to bring us what we're looking for, to the part of our strategy that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. And it's like, never again am I going to restrict myself based on these shoulds and shouldn'ts. Like, what a relief. I can live life free of shoulds and shouldn'ts. So what if life is completely predetermined? How life unfolds is a story that will unfold only one way. Someone might say, yeah, that's all philosophy. I've never seen life turn out more than one way. So if our attitude aligns to, well, it's true, life will only turn out one way at any point in time. It's one way. So why not align with the one way? Instead of having an idea of another way and then being in conflict with the one way when it's not in line with our idea of how life should be. That's what is meant by it is what it is. Or it just is. No more comparing it against the psychological benchmark that we have of how it should be. I had come across a quote some time back that I thought was very nice in relation to this particular topic. And it said, happiness is not getting what you want, but rather wanting what you get. And that means that if someone drops a brick on your toe, which means that's what you got, wanting what you got doesn't mean that you wish for that or that you're excited about that when it happens and oh, that's exactly what I wanted. It's something more subtle. It means, so happiness isn't getting what you want, but rather wanting what you get, which really is talking about a non-resistance to what happens. It's not, if we wanted to rephrase it so that it's a little bit more accurate in a way that we can appreciate it, because actually it's perfect the way it is once we understand what it's really saying. But if we're going to reword it just to be clear on what it says, happiness is not getting what you want, but rather not resisting what you get. And how can you attitudinally not resist what you get? And the only way is if you don't have an pre-existing benchmark, a pre-existing image of how life should look in the next moment. That pre-existing image is what we call expectation. So if we can reconcile with the fact that in each moment life only ever turns out one way, and that one way is not something I can control, because life in its complexity includes far too many interconnected components that are completely out of my control. And frankly, even if only 1 out of 1,000,000 components was out of your control, and yet all the components are interconnected, in theory, you have no control. Because of that one component that you're not in control of. But when we look at life, actually we look at the millions of components and we see that very few of them do we have control over, if any. Even what seems to be in my control is a result of these many interconnected factors that we're not in control of. So that means reconciling with the notion that life will turn out one way in each moment. So why don't I replace my expectation, which really makes no real sense when we see life more clearly. Let me just replace my expectation with a blank frame that we allow to get filled, not ahead of time, but at the moment that life unfolds. So let your expectation be simultaneous with what's happening and matching with what's happening. Which really means the dissolution of the old type of expectation. The dissolution of the expectation that says, this is how life should be. You know, the avalanche should be moving a little bit to the left at the moment, and please a little bit to the right. That's nonsensical, right? The avalanche is going to come down the mountain according to its destiny, not according to our request. So putting an expectation on life is as nonsensical as putting an expectation on the avalanche. Only if we see that will we stop expecting life to be a certain way. If we don't see the nonsensicalness of setting up expectation, we will continue to set up expectation. That's why expectation has started in the first place, because we think it's reasonable to have an expectation. And furthermore, that expectation is what I believe is going to make everything okay. So why not have that expectation and then try and control life in order for life to turn out that way? From a certain way of looking at life, it would seem stupid not to do that. When we start to see life more clearly, we start to see the stupidity of it. I mean, go ahead if you want, by all means. Wouldn't it be nice if you're walking around and someone cuts you off on the road and you go, very clearly, God has designed life in this moment for it to be perfect only when that person cuts me off. Wouldn't it be nice if you're walking down the street and someone bumps into you and knocks your drink out of your hand, and you can attitudinally laugh at the fact that that's life in this moment? And if a reaction happens that is not sort of attitudinally laughing at the fact that someone has bumped into you and knocked your drink out of your hand, and in fact what happens is that you start getting angry at the person, is there something that can witness the anger as part of the momentary experience? And that too is meant to be there. When I say meant to be there as the one way that life unfolds in each moment. Now, this wouldn't be particularly satisfying to the part of ourself that is convinced that our happiness is to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. So, to the part of us that is convinced that our happiness will be found only when life looks a certain way, the description that life only turns out one way, even though quite blatantly obvious, is simply not acceptable. It says, no, I'm not going to just sit by and watch life turn out. I'm going to do my damnedest that it turns out the way I need it to turn out. Makes sense. The good news, however, is that as we start to experience life from another perspective, we start to say, I don't even need life to turn out a certain way in order to be content. So if we start to experience contentness, peace, which is what we've always been looking for, whether we realize it or not, and we've been thinking that we might find that through outcomes, if we start to experience what we've always been looking for independent of outcomes, what a great freedom that is. And how it helps for expectation to start falling away. Because not only when an expectation gets put in place, we see not only is expectation unrealistic, because life is this moving feast beyond our control. So we start to see, if I put up an expectation, that is the very basis for disappointment, the very basis for frustration. So not only do we see that expectation is flawed in that sense, but we also see that it's not necessary in order for me to be at peace. Only if we start experiencing peace independent of outcomes. How are we going to experience peace independent of outcomes? Only when life delivers what is required to bring about this change in functioning. A change in the function of being on the treadmill and trying to think and work out life by bringing about change, to a new gear from where we live life, a gear of dropping into being. And if anyone's feeling frustrated at the moment because there is a sense of discomfort with the present moment, then attitudinally, possibly, there comes in the attitude that says, oh, in this moment, the one way that life is unfolding includes a sense of dissatisfaction or discomfort. And that dissatisfaction or discomfort can then be seen in a greater scope. Maybe experienced differently within a broader container. we actually need to see the relativity of our thinking. And for the purpose of this phase that I'm talking about, not only the relativity, but the complete inadequacy of thought, the complete inaccuracy of thought. And so there are various parables, stories, wisdom stories, that are designed to start demonstrating to us how we relate to our thinking in a way that is not optimal. Or not only relate to our thinking, but how our thinking relates to circumstance in a way that's not optimal. One of those parables is the parable of the Chinese farmer who obviously has a lot of wisdom, and circumstance turns out to be not so favorable. I don't know the particulars of this parable, but I'm sure everyone has come across it. So the farmer receives some bad news. His horse has died. So the neighbors come in and say, "This is very bad news, we're so sorry for you." And the farmer says, "Maybe." It turns out that because the farmer's horse has died, the farmer's son needs to work in the fields. And the farmer's son breaks his leg. And the neighbors come and say, "This is terrible news, we're so sorry for you." And he says, "Maybe." And the next day, the soldiers come through the area looking for people to take off to war. And the farmer's son has a broken leg and he's overlooked. And the neighbors come by and say, "This is such great news." And the farmer says, "Maybe." I've actually mixed up this story, right? It doesn't really matter. The point is that the farmer is looking at outcomes that on the surface appear to be bad news, or on the surface appear to be good news, and he sees that bad circumstance can become favorable, and favorable circumstance can become not favorable. And our mind will create a story about circumstance. And the story is, it will turn the circumstance into something definite. This is what it means. This is good or this is bad. The wise farmer says, "Maybe." So the wise farmer is essentially tempering a certain type of thinking that believes itself to be true. And is saying, well, it's relative. The thinking, the story is relative. So let me not have that story. Let me just see what happens. So until we become aware of the fact that our thinking is completely misguided a lot of the time, and we can continue to believe the storyline of our thoughts instead of relating to it as if it's, at best we'll say, well, maybe. Sometimes it's much better to take the view that our thinking has absolutely no idea about reality. It's completely wrong. And especially if we start to become familiar with suffering thinking and realize that suffering thinking is completely underestimating, completely seeing life incorrectly. And so we can relate to the suffering as if it's completely misguided when it's kicked in and creating stories of guilt or blame, expectation, victimhood. It's like, there it goes again. That completely inaccurate function. It's always lying to us. If it's exposed as a liar, it doesn't mean it's going to suddenly vanish. It may have enough momentum that it hangs around for a while. But if a part of us starts seeing it as a complete fraud, a complete liar, then there can be a disinterest in it. I wouldn't suggest that we see it as a liar and then we start to want to kill it or silence it, because that might be a movement beyond the middle path. And that movement may also be misguided thinking. Good enough for us to see thinking as limited and be disinterested in thinking. The story loses its grip if we become disinterested in thought. Because all suffering is a story about life. All suffering is an attitude that we have towards life. Essentially an attitude that says, life is attacking me. The other is attacking me. The other is taking something away that I need in order to be complete. If we see life as a creation unfolding and we are part of the creation, then any thought that arises that judges life, and life means the other and how they function, life means myself and how I function, we might start to see, look, there's a thought, a thinking that is completely out of line with seeing life as a spontaneous creation that is only ever one way. So whatever allows us to undermine the various forms of thinking that create uncomfortableness, create a disconnection, create a separation from ourselves, is very, very useful in this seeking. Anything that creates an interference with the habitual thinking that has been in place for years and years and years. And the interference needs to be supported by a dropping into being. Otherwise, the interference doesn't create a significant enough gap. It's only when a thought arises that says, stop, that's nonsense, that's a lie, and we have somewhere to drop into that is outside of the spectrum of circumstance, outside of the spectrum of thinking, do we find that the thinking subsides for long enough for it to be beneficial? And this is something that happens gradually over time, the strengthening of being able to find ourselves outside of thinking is something that happens over time. It's like having a weak leg muscle, and the doctor says you need to do weeks of therapy to strengthen that muscle. And the first 2 hours of therapy are essential for the process. You can't get to the end without the first 2 hours of the physical therapy. And yet, after the first 2 hours of physical therapy, you, in practice, may feel like nothing has changed. Because you might need 1,000 hours of physical therapy to get the muscle to where it needs to be, and the first 2 hours are a drop in the bucket. Where in practice, it might feel like this is a total waste of time. And yet if it's understood that the first 2 hours are the first 2 hours of 1,000 hours that will lead to a muscle that is capable of holding you up again. So dropping out of thinking is a process that is supported by contemplating about, which is thinking, the irony, contemplating about our thinking and recognizing that we're so convinced that our thoughts are right, and yet our experience tells us time and time again that we've had arguments with people about how things are, only to find out 2 weeks later that we were wrong. And, in the argument, we were dead set, we would put our life on the fact that we were right. So seeing this becomes part of the food, essentially, for the understanding that our thinking is often misguided. It becomes the real understanding. And as that understanding kicks in, the next time that we are convinced about something, our understanding kicks in and goes, maybe not. Maybe it's not quite like that. Don't be so sure. Our shoulds and shouldn'ts are a great structure of this exact principle that I'm talking about today. The shoulds and shouldn'ts are a set of beliefs about what will be best for me. I should work very hard and save up for my retirement. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but I'm saying that your belief that that is absolutely true is completely wrong. Not that it's not true, but believing that it's absolutely true is wrong. because you might die tomorrow. And so you would have possibly been, it might have been better not to put the money in the bank. Which doesn't mean that you shouldn't save for retirement. It just means that you won't hold a concept that you're running with as absolute truth. So when we start to see that my shoulds and shouldn'ts are not absolute in the way that I've believed them to be absolute, they can start to shake and become less strong. And that can be very liberating. Because the truth is that once certain structures get put in place, we live our whole life through that same structure. Which means we could have lived our whole life through a series of shoulds and shouldn'ts that has taken us to where we are. And if where we are doesn't feel like the ideal way of living life, then the crumbling of shoulds and shouldn'ts could be instrumental in things taking a turn for the better. I'm not talking about a circumstantial turn for the better, but rather an attitudinal shift that brings about more peace. So the attitudinal shift will be, I don't know what I should do. The other person doesn't know what I should do. How can the other person possibly know what I should do? Have they got some special line up to God and He's telling them what I should do? And if we spoke to God and said, God, what should I do? He'd say, well, I'll only know after you've done it. God doesn't even know what you should do. So then you go, well, I don't know what I should do. Which is not a problem, because you'll still function. And so then that becomes the new set of instructions. Is I'll function, I'll allow myself to function, and that's what should happen. So another way of saying that is, in each moment, do exactly what you think or feel to do. That sounds like freedom. The part of our mind that is attached to outcome says, yeah, but, so what if someone wants to steal your car because that's what they think or feel to do, then is that okay? And I'd say, well, attitudinally, yes. That means that there is a deep understanding that life is going to turn out one way in each moment. And the understanding also understands that how life turns out doesn't determine my completeness. So only then can we offer complete freedom to the other and complete freedom to ourselves.
The thing is that sometimes it's not in the mind, it's in the body. The feeling of attachment to something or some way the things has to be, because it's unconscious. The pain or the sadness. And there is no words even, no? But it captures me sometimes.
Sure, it does. When I say these deeply ingrained beliefs that are in the mind, they are so deeply ingrained, they no longer are experienced as thought, but they are experienced as sensation, bodily feelings, fear or desire. It's still a belief that is at the root of that fear or desire, that attachment. But it's very important for us to understand that when I talk about mind and beliefs, in their very ingrained form, it isn't just thought, but it arises as feeling. And it's, when we start talking a little bit more about non-doership, it starts to explain that this is not a prescription for someone to stop being afraid, because we can't stop being afraid when the beliefs are of a certain intensity. Because of exactly what you described, is that belief has a certain intensity and therefore it has a certain power. And that power comes up with a certain force, and it forces us to function a certain way. And why we can become emotional is because another part of us realizes that this is not good for me. It's not giving me what I really want. And yet I'm compelled to function that way. So the compassion of understanding the non-doership aspect, which means if the beliefs are there with a certain intensity, they will drive us to function a certain way, and there's nothing that we can do to fight that. However, life can gradually or very quickly bring about a change in the structure of the belief systems. And then we find that what used to have extreme power over us and drive functioning in a certain way is no longer the same. So what we're both saying, what you said is simple factual description that the intensity of the beliefs will create a feeling that grips us, a feeling that drives us. That's exactly right. And talking about these dynamics sheds light onto them because they're not often understood or talked about. And as we start to see them in this new light, change happens. And at a certain point, if we realize that living according to shoulds and shouldn'ts has kept us trapped, there will be, at a certain point, the balance of power will have changed enough up to that point, and then at that point it's like, no, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to live out of this fear of what I should do. But that, what seems like bravery, is simply a result of change. And at that point, it couldn't have happened 2 weeks earlier because the change hadn't happened. But then at that point, nothing can hold it back. Once it gets to a certain point, it's like, no, I'm not going to do this. So, it's a matter of letting life unfold. But you might find that desire to do something differently come up at any point.
You said that we don't need anything on the outside to be content, and I'm struggling with the thought pattern of why should anybody do anything that, for example, beautifies the world. Let's take putting up a rose on a table. Where is the difference between doing this and being on the treadmill by doing this? Because having the feeling that I have to beautify my outside world could be, if I follow you, a part of being on the treadmill. It doesn't look like it. It looks good, or it looks right, or it looks beautiful. And how do these movements in life come about once I've realized that there is nothing I need on the outside to be content?
Mm-hmm. So good. There's two parts to the question. The second part is, how would anything happen? What would motivate me to do anything in life if my attachment to outcome falls away? So once I'm completely, deeply immersed in the experience that my completeness is not dependent on outcomes, what is going to move me to live life, to eat, to talk to someone, to paint a picture? So that's the second part of your question. And the first part of your question is, should I realize that I have an ingrained movement that is seeking pleasure in outcomes? If I realize this, then how deep does that go? Does it extend to everything that I'm doing? Is that same attitude that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, is it pervading everything that I'm doing in life? The simple answer is that it probably is, that attachment to outcomes is an underlying attitude that becomes all pervasive. The areas that are best addressed first are the areas where we can see for ourselves, based on some very direct feedback, that there is attachment in that particular movement. And that is those areas where there is very obvious discomfort, uneasiness, suffering. And so that means if there is no flower available to put on your table, what is the feeling towards the person that hasn't, delivered the flower today? What is the relationship, the attitude towards that circumstance not having turned out according to what you would normally do? So, in other words, if things aren't available and we feel attacked by the fact that they're not available, then it's fair for us to say that, my attachment to outcomes is very much intertwined with that particular outcome. If there are outcomes that can go either way, and you find that your resistance to it going either way is the resistance isn't there, then you can conclude the opposite. The attachment to that outcome is not strong, because there's no resistance when it doesn't turn out that way. And so each of us will have our own particular attachment. Someone might be more attached to appreciation from the other than attached to material gain, let's say. And someone else might be much more attached to material gain than to what the others think about them. And that starts to that can be our litmus test to understand what our attachment is, what our identity is most attached to, what we are most dependent on. And so in a lot of spiritual practices, there is a movement that creates a disinterest in pleasure and pain, a disinterest in outcomes. So the practice of renunciation, where in a way we're told that indulging in pleasure is problematic, is ignorant, and there's an encouragement to be disinterested in pleasure or pain. Now, that's like most of the spiritual process, that in itself is not freedom, but it's a methodology, it's a process, it's part of where freedom will be found. So what that means is that ultimately renouncing pleasures is not the ultimate integration. It's not the ultimate way of relating to life. However, if the attachment exists, then certain measures may need to be taken in order to break the attachment, and that might include renouncing pleasures. So that means not putting a rose on your table for a period of time, and realizing that actually I still am, I still exist, even with no decoration on the table. And that's why, the monks will shave their head and not wear fancy clothes and have cold showers and hard bed and simple food, no sex. In an attempt to break the attachment to those external requirements, and to find in meditation that I am complete even without all of those things. And once that groundedness in one's own completion is there and is stabilized, we then find that there's no problem in adding back in the pleasures. Now we've added the pleasures back in once we are very familiar with the core of our own being, knowing that it doesn't require fancy clothes in order to be complete. And yet, why would I push away fancy clothes if they add an extra layer of depth to life? The answer is, if there is attachment, there is a good reason to push them away, because it is part of the methodology of undoing the attachment. But once the attachment is undone, why not be grounded in one's own self, and then also get to enjoy the pleasures of life in the same way as you inevitably have to endure the pains of life. Doing so, understanding that the pleasure and pain is not going to add or subtract to that part of myself that I have become familiar with, thanks to the process that broke the attachment to outcomes. And so going on to the second part of the question, what drives us to enjoy the nice food, for example, even though our attachment to nice food has been broken, is our biological preference, which is something that remains even when the attachment to outcomes has fallen away. So attachment to outcomes fall away, and then you still find that you have a preference for tomato instead of broccoli. And yet, if tomato isn't available, you don't find yourself in an existential crisis. Because I exist independent of my preferences being delivered. But because my preferences still exist, even though my attachment to my preferences being delivered having fallen away, my preference still exists, and so if it's available, I'm going to move towards it. And so in each moment, the body has its preferences, and the preference kicks in and says, I would like to get out of bed now. And so if that's available, the body will move in the direction of its preference and get out of bed. And when the urge, when hunger arises, which is a biological arising, then there is our preference kicks in to satisfy the hunger. And so there is a movement towards food as a response to the biological preference in the moment. If food isn't available, then we will find that there is hunger, the preference of being satisfied by food isn't available, and we remain at peace. So it's the biological preference that will continue to move the body towards its pleasures and away from its pains. That is what will inspire Buddha to talk, Buddha to draw a beautiful picture, if he happened to be an artist.
To continue the topic about common sense and attachment to security. So sometimes I just ask myself the question that my preference would be to stop working. And it's very clear for many years already. But common sense says, okay, you need to provide medical insurance at least for your son, if you can forget about yourself. So this is, for me, part of common sense. Then the contemplation comes and says, okay, but maybe this is the attachment to the security. And I don't suffer that I have to get up and go to work, so I can cope with this very fine, but sometimes I just wonder, how is it? Because I'm working for almost 20 years and it's just a curiosity maybe. How is it? However, what doesn't let me do is this security, and I don't know if it's attachment or just the common sense, so how to discern between those.
Well, the easy way to discern it is by being familiar with suffering, being familiar with what it feels like, and if the suffering isn't there, then it's not attachment. Because there is an intelligence that functions through the body that will say, though the body says, well, my preference is to sleep in till 10 o'clock. Work needs you to get up at 6 o'clock. The intelligence in the body, which is not attachment, if it knows that you sleeping in till 10 o'clock is going to mean that you will starve or your son won't get the things that are needed, then the intelligence essentially puts a whole lot of your preferences together and comes up with the intelligent choice, which really is actually, our mind can look at one particular preference and say, well, it isn't my preference to get up at 6 in the morning. It's my preference to stay in bed till 10. But it's also not your preference to starve. And so when you look at the two preferences there, it's not my preference to get up at 6 in the morning, but it's not my preference to starve. Then you see that the combination of the two means get up at 6 in the morning. And the question then is, well, how much of attachment is playing into that mix? And that's exactly what happens, is because someone will say, well, I don't want to get up at 6 in the morning. I'd like to get up at 10 in the morning. But I also have a preference for my Ferrari. You know, and now that's very different to the preference to put a roof over your family's head. The preference for a Ferrari may well be an attachment. It doesn't have to be, but it could be. And so how we start to refine this is by being very discerning with our internal landscape. And the feeling of suffering is what will point us to the next layer of attachment that needs to be dealt with. And something like you going to work year after year after year may actually not be attachment. It may be part of the biological intelligence. And so if there is this discernment that is aware of the suffering and inquiring into it and seeing where the attachment lies and actively starting to challenge that attachment, if that's happening, then you know that the principle of becoming aware of suffering and inquiring into it is already at play. And so if this topic of working isn't what that principle is focused on, it either is an attachment that isn't at the top of the list at the moment, or it's not an attachment. So this being able to feel what suffering feels like is very important, because that's your indicator of what to inquire into.
Yeah, I was actually contemplating in the very similar way as you describe, and I found that it was maybe even the idea, sometimes for sure on the path we all hear the step into the unknown, that it was maybe this idea somewhere stuck in my head that I should try and step to this unknown. However, I don't feel the real suffering continuing working, but I understand what you mean. So
yeah, well, it's stepping into the unknown when it doesn't relate to suffering could just be stupidity, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. If you just turn it off for the time being. Yeah.
Okay, to follow up on the topic, what Sir in the red shirt said, I think he also mentioned what one would be doing if there is peace of mind in regards to having a job or daily living. And would you say that being interested in things, is that also a biological preference? Is that correct?
That the interest in things is a biological, yeah, absolutely. When there is peace of mind and attachment has fallen away, you will really only do what you are interested in.
Yes, so for example, if one is interested in finances, then it makes sense to become a stockbroker and do that for a living.
Yes, if that's what you're interested in, it would make sense.
Yes.
Yeah, you might be interested in being in nature much more, and you might also have an interest in finance, and so then you might come up with a hybrid of the two that clearly shows that your interest in being a stockbroker, for example, isn't from attachment to more, because you set it up in such a way that you might do 4 hours of work a day or whatever. That shows that there is a biological interest in doing the amount of work, which could include supporting yourself. And yet, that's not, what's the word? It's not compromising everything else, which is what attachment tends to do. Attachment tends to compromise everything else and want only what we are attached to. So what we end up with is a lot more balance when we are functioning from peace of mind, because the biological preferences, which in themselves tend to be much more balanced, get to all function together, and so we end up with this, with life falling into place, where as much of what we like gets catered to.
And for a lot of people, it can be a tricky part to actually find out what they are interested in, because they have a lot of shoulds and shouldn'ts, maybe imposed from their parents, what they should be doing and should not be doing. So
yes, but that would mean that they don't have peace of mind, because the shoulds and shouldn'ts would. So when we have peace of mind, you'll find it's the easiest thing, because when I said what I'm interested in, when I said we'll only ever move in line with what we are interested in, it isn't a sort of preconceived idea of what I'm interested in. Not even preconceived based on what I've been interested in the past 3 years up to today, but something much more alive that tells me what I'm interested in that moment. So I would say, if a friend of mine rings up and says, "Can you help me pack up my house and move some furniture?" without the shoulds and shouldn'ts, I go to the body to answer that question. And the body might say, "I am completely uninterested in helping my friend pack up his house." Or the body says, "I couldn't be interested in anything more than helping my friend pack up his house right now." And I don't mean that sarcastically, because he's a friend, let's say, not because I should or shouldn't, but just because of the very nature of our exact relationship in this moment. Not from some conceptual idea of our friendship, but from the actual friendship itself, and the request itself in relation to not only the friendship, but how I'm feeling in this moment, in relation to all my other friends and all my other commitments and my body and everything. And so if you think, "Oh my God, I have to work all of this out all of the time," then it's very complicated. But it could be much, much simpler than that. And it's just about feeling what I'm interested in this moment. And doing that. And then someone might say, "Well, but what if in this moment I'm interested in setting up a stockbroking business, and then in the next moment I'm not interested in it, and I'm interested in setting up a film business, and then I'm not interested in that, and the next day I'm interested in traveling." I say, "Okay, well, that's good. You just do that, because that is clearly a process of things settling down. And eventually you'll find that there is a consistency in what you are interested in. And so you'll find if you're interested in setting up a stockbroking firm, and the next day you're interested in doing the next step, and the next day you're interested in doing the next step. And at any stage you're open to not being interested anymore. You're 90% of the way there, because you were interested all the way, and you're open to the fact, if I'm not interested the day after, then I'm going to move in the direction that I'm interested in. The likelihood is that your interest, once everything is settled down, becomes your true interests, which doesn't mean they will remain consistent forever, but they will probably be consistent enough for you to put things in place, do them for a while, maybe a long while. And so I guess what I'm getting at is there is a real biological intelligence that once it's allowed to function unimpeded, it makes life so simple and really so efficient and balanced, because we're not getting in the way of planning things, and we're really allowing the biological intelligence to function. And this goes to your point that you made, is that if the conditioning of shoulds and shouldn'ts, of attachments, isn't there, then this intelligence gets to function. But if there is a whole lot of shoulds and shouldn'ts in the system, then it can feel very confusing. Like, what is this urge coming from? Is this urge in this moment coming from my biological interests or my attachments? And there isn't really an answer to that or a solution, other than, or what I would suggest is, continue to do what you feel like, understanding that what you feel like could be being influenced by attachment. And if you remain present with the feeling, you'll find that you start to recognize how you feel after you've started doing something that comes from attachment. And you'll find that there will be a sense of dissatisfaction a lot of the time when you're being driven by something that is coming from attachment. You'll achieve it, and there'll be a sense of dissatisfaction. You won't achieve it, and there'll be a sense of dissatisfaction. And so then you'll be able to start discerning which of the movements that at first were indistinguishable as to whether they were coming from attachment or not, you'll start to become sensitive as to what attachment feels like and what a real biological preference feels like. So it's simply practice, I guess, you could say.
Would you say that talents are a kind of pointer what one is interested in or what one should be doing? Because obviously if I am not good at math, I shouldn't be a stockbroker or shouldn't work in finances.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's kind of a requirement, I guess, to be successful in a sense in that field.
Mm-hmm. Well, you see, just so, even when we put in the word shouldn't, that's what I shouldn't be doing. If I'm not good at maths, I shouldn't be a stockbroker. Maybe that's even a part of the shoulds and shouldn'ts. And so what I would be pointing to is I said, no, don't even put that restriction there. Just do what you feel like. And if you feel like being in finance and you're not good at maths, but you feel like it, you'll soon see whether you should or shouldn't be doing it. Not from an idea of I should or shouldn't, but from the actual experience. And so when you draw a conclusion based on certain experiences, then you're not just running with a blind should or shouldn't. Your parent can tell you you shouldn't put your hand on the hot plate. You'll burn your hand. And you can just believe that. It becomes a should and shouldn't. If you start to see from experience that putting my hand on the hot plate burns it, it's not my preference, and then you say to yourself, don't put your hand on the hot plate, that's not from shoulds or shouldn'ts. That's from your own direct experience. It's part of the intelligence. So you're not keeping away from the hot plate because you shouldn't put your hand on it, but because you know that doesn't serve me. And therefore, it's, drop all of the ideas that are not confirmed from your own experience. Your father might have told you, you're no good at maths, you shouldn't be a stockbroker. You might find that you have an amazing talent regardless of your bad math skills, to pick people that come and present to you, and you have a sense, this is a real manager, this is someone that's going to make something happen with this business. Someone else comes and you go, I wouldn't put any money in with that person, in their business. And you might be the best investment manager. Yeah. But talents, that's what your question was. If you have a talent and you naturally produce things that are good because of your talent, and especially if you enjoy using that talent, if you enjoy seeing the talent flow through you, then that would be most probably when you do what you feel like and you start putting that talent into play, it would probably be feel very aligned. So in a sense, I was talking about a talent that you would have of being able to pick those people that you feel are authentic and will do a good job, as opposed to those that are not going to be great. But it comes down to allowing life to flow, really. Life is going to unfold one way. I don't believe there is a God that will talk to us, but to put across the point, if you ask God, how did I do in life? God will say, you were perfect. You did exactly what you were destined to do at each moment. So God will never judge us. God knows that we have been designed to function a particular way. So how can God possibly say, well, you didn't do so well over there? It's like me telling my robot, if I build a robot, and it starts putting holes in the wall, and I say to the robot, you didn't do a very good job over there. It's like the robot is doing what I programmed it to do. So I can't tell the robot it hasn't done a good job. I say to the robot, you've done a wonderful job. Exactly as I programmed you. So if we can start to really feel, then we can allow ourselves to move freely, knowing that we're not going to be judged by God. And so if we don't fear God, we can love God. Society, on the other hand, society will judge us. But that's understandable. So this understanding that society is still going to punish us for those actions that happen through us that deliver pain to society, and society will reward us for those actions that happen through us that deliver pleasure to society, and at the same time knowing that God will never judge us. That mix is a very healthy mix where we don't think that we are irresponsible to society. So we'll never be responsible to God. God will never hold us responsible. Society will always hold us responsible. So this understanding of life from this perspective isn't carte blanche where we psychologically can say, oh well, so in that case I can do whatever I want and there'll be no consequences. There will be consequences from society. But hopefully we don't hold the consequences from society as all important in such a way that it will then interfere with us functioning naturally.
But then it looks like, what I observe is that when you said, when we drop to I am, we relax. But then when the should and shouldn't drop, it's not even a relaxation, it's then full trust, because then this intelligence that you were talking about starts to function somehow, and then these are both full relaxation and full trust, and you just is.
It's, yes, although it can even be much simpler, because we find if the shoulds and shouldn'ts dissolve, then maybe there's not even a question of trust. Because all that is there is the biological functioning, where you're not even second-guessing yourself. So even the notion of trust brings in a sort of separation, the one that is trusting the body. Where if the shoulds and shouldn'ts fall away, then it's like, well, I just am in perpetual motion. Life is in perpetual motion. And whatever happens next is a response or a movement of life. So, yes, from one perspective we can say it is to just trust that life is always in motion. But it's not really an action of trust. It's not an effort, an effortless trust. It's like acceptance is not something you do. Acceptance is the absence of non-acceptance. And trust is the absence of distrust, the absence of doubt. So if that falls away, then in the same way as we find, I am accepting of life, which doesn't require us to make any effort, it just means that the non-accepting is not arising. In the same way, you go, I trust life. But actually, if you try and find your acceptance, if you try and find your trust, you find that you're not really putting any effort into being trusting or being accepting. It's just there as a natural movement when its opposite isn't present.
Impersonal. Impersonal.
Yes, it's impersonal.
It's rather a comment than a question. The sense of doership is obviously very strong and not even seen. You mentioned the analogy of the avalanche before, and it's a lot easier to see life as a happening in outside circumstances, but more difficult to see oneself and the other the same way.
Mm-hmm.
And it came to my mind, I think that Nisargadatta said that we happen to see life as a happening, but we fail to include ourselves in that.
Brilliant, yes, exactly. That's the separation. If you can come to see that your own functioning is simply physics, like the functioning of the avalanche, then what has happened is the understanding of the physics of life gets extended into what we don't experience as the physics of life. Internally, it feels like me doing my speaking and my thinking. So it's good to start with some of the impersonal functions of the organs that we know are happening, like the filtering that the liver does, the pumping that the heart does, and it can become clear, I'm not doing that. Imagine if we had to be in control of that. You wouldn't have a minute to rest, because it's essential that that functions well. And yet we don't put any attention onto that, and it's very clear that it's just happening. And it's physics, essentially. It's biological physics. And thinking is the function of an organ. And the actions that happen are the function of this bigger organ, the human being, which is a whole lot of organs. And the thinking is a result of the brain's design, genes and up-to-date conditioning. You can't help but have the thought that you have in this moment. It's not optional. You can't choose, only psychologically would we say, I should have done something differently. I should have not had that reaction to the circumstance. That's hypothetical. How could you have done it differently given the reaction, the thought, the emotion is a result of a very complex organism functioning? you would have had to be a different organism to function differently. So this notion of I should have acted differently is completely based on this belief in personal doership, which is a belief in an entity that doesn't exist, the doer. Really what exists is an organism that is functioning according to its design. And we just don't relate to the movements of the body as that. And once I was watching a documentary, which was a documentary about the teachings of Stephen Hawking, the physicist that has now passed away. He was alive at the time, but the documentary was a transcript, so it was by a narrator. But it was Stephen Hawking's theories. And he said in this documentary, which was talking about essentially the predetermination of life, he said, this was the phrase, thinking is just physics. Thinking is a result of electromagnetic impulses in a very complex neural network. Just physics. And that wasn't earth-shattering or new to me, that was just a confirmation of something that was completely evident to me from a certain perspective, that I simply couldn't see the functioning of the human being any different to the functioning of a dog or the functioning of a river. Completely determined by impersonal factors. And yet I appreciate how those impersonal factors create this very personal sense. Create a belief system that says, I am doing it. Who is this I that is doing it? There is a body-mind organism functioning, but there is no me that controls the functioning of the body-mind organism. The belief, I am doing it, is the fictitious me. The sense, I am the controller of my thoughts. Who control the thoughts? Are the output of a brain or the output of a spontaneous creation. They're just whichever way you look at it, whether we look at it from causality or from spontaneous arising point of view, a thought just is there. It's either come from nothing into the present moment, or it's come from the functioning of the brain and it's the output of a brain. The me, the doer, is a fictitious entity contained in a very strong belief structure. So when spirituality talks about there is no person, what they're talking about is there is no doer. There is a person from another perspective. If we use a different definition of person, the one speaking is a person, but the person is not a separate, independent, personal entity with complete personal volition. The person that is here speaking is part of life. Life has grown the organism, which we can call the person, and the person functions. The person is not the doer. So if we then drop the idea of person and we use the word person to describe doership, we can say there is no so when you hear this, when you hear someone saying in a spiritual, there is no person, they mean there is no one except for the body and the brain and the consciousness. There is no one controlling. And the death that is spoken about is the death of that fictitious entity, the fictitious belief. And when it's seen, like, who is this me, other than a thought, other than a belief overlaying onto, so it's like the river is, moving, and then someone believes that they are moving the river. So they claim ownership over being the one, what that is one with the movement of the river. So the analogy often used is the little kid in the back of the car on their steering wheel thinking that they are driving the car. And that is a fictitious belief that they are the driver. They aren't the driver. So there is no doer.
And I guess one has to see this for oneself happening, like seeing that the thought arises.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, it's merely an intellectual understanding that you are not the doer.
Instead of so you have to see it for yourself.
Exactly.
And what was the last part you said?
If your awareness doesn't see that, it's merely a intellectual understanding that
yes.
you're not the doer.
And the intellectual understanding will function something like this. Well, let's not call it an intellectual understanding. Let's call it a belief that I'm not the doer. Right? The belief I'm not the doer will kick in when we're in life and things are happening and there is a reaction of doership. So there is the uncomfortableness. And yet there is then the belief saying, oh, but I'm not the doer. And I'm not the doer belief doesn't undermine the uncomfortableness of doership. So what it means is there is the belief that I am the doer, and then the belief that I am not the doer. And it turns out the belief that I am not the doer doesn't have the effect of undoing the belief in personal doership. But as that belief becomes more and more deep, more and more seen in experience, and where we really get what it means.
So the belief gets turned into experience, or
yes.
is confirmed by experience.
Confirmed by experience, that's it. So the teachings are pointers. So the pointer says the body is this complex organism, and that the totality of the organism we can say is a result of these two factors: genes, the blueprint, the organism blueprint, and the moment after moment conditioning that the genes are not separate from. So the conditioning and the genes are actually one thing in each moment. That's the organism. So someone can understand that intellectually and say, oh yeah, I get it. But in practice, the belief in personal doership continues to explode whenever things are happening. And if that's the case, you can see that the conceptual description, genes and up-to-date conditioning, hasn't really gone very deep. But if we start seeing that there is a reaction that is exactly in line with how my father reacts, for example, and we know that our parents are a large part of our up-to-date conditioning. And so we see the reaction and we see that, wow, I'm functioning the same way that, following the same principles and same values that my father has. And then you see, well, it's not just some very strange coincidence that that's the case. It's because I have been exposed to that conditioning that says this is very important. And then we see ourselves functioning according to that conditioning. So then the notion of in each moment we are a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning is seen experientially. It's revealed to us in practice rather than it just being an abstract concept. And then we see another function that, let's say, I'm speaking English. Why am I not speaking Japanese? Why doesn't the spontaneous creation have me speaking Japanese? When I look at it, well, of course, because my genes and up-to-date conditioning has not been of up-to-date conditioning of Japanese, but up-to-date conditioning in school and throughout my life of English. I mean, why do I see the chair with the level of detail that I see the chair? Because of my eyes being the way they are. If I have 20/20 vision, I see the chair clearly. If I have very restricted vision, then I won't see the chair clearly because of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. So when it comes to sight, up-to-date conditioning in terms of society's concepts of right and wrong, that doesn't influence my sight, but my genetics does. So my whole experience and the way that I function is based on two factors only, genes and up-to-date conditioning. Why can I answer or talk about this subject? Because I have spent 25 years contemplating just this topic, and each time that there is a thought and a contemplation and an observation, all of that is new conditioning. The output, the conclusions, the insights are all part of the new conditioning that becomes part of the up-to-date conditioning. I spent years sitting, listening to Ramesh, and then the contemplations happened as a result of the pointers that Ramesh was putting forward. So, if someone asks me about knitting, I can't give them a very good answer. It's not part of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. So it really is, I've had on retreats, not just on retreats, but people who watch the videos over and over and over again. And then what I surprisingly get sometimes is, I don't really understand, I don't get the non-doership bit. I think, wow. But it's explained, isn't it? That whatever we do is a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. That means we can't be the doers. We can only be functioning according to what life has put in place. So to me, it's completely obvious, not as a concept. What the person is saying when they go, I don't really get the non-doership, is they go, I might get what you're saying intellectually, but experientially, I simply can't see life or experience what is happening through me as a happening. I can only experience it as my doing. That's what is really being said, and that I get. But as we start to see what the pointers are pointing at for ourselves, our internal genes and up-to-date conditioning change, and then our experience is that I'm not doing anything. Life is happening. Life is functioning through me, and life is functioning through all of us in exactly the same way. The same principle is functioning through me as is functioning through you.
And I guess there must be some kind of curiosity or interest in finding this out, and not just trying to get rid of the suffering, but I am not really interested in the teaching. That's not going to work.
It doesn't work. It's a really good point. I've never really addressed it, but it's come up many times outside of a talk. And that is that if someone is interested in the teachings only when suffering comes in, that's the worst time to be interested in the teachings, because there's no space. Because suffering takes up all the space. And so you can't see life clearly when there is suffering present. Because when there is suffering present, you only see life through the lens of suffering. So if someone turns to spiritual teachings when there is suffering only, and then when there's no suffering, they're not interested, it's like, yeah, keep your nonsense to yourself, I'm now enjoying, whatever, then that's a little unfortunate for them, because the deepening, the actual seeing that needs to happen for oneself isn't going to happen, because the investigation isn't happening when there is space. Now that's not a judgment or a criticism, it's that is a recognition that the genes and up-to-date conditioning of that person are such that when there is no suffering, they are interested just in pleasure. And then when the suffering comes in, it's like, okay, how do I get rid of this? Spiritual teachings. But spiritual teachings are not going to work if you engage in them as a means to an end, which really means trying to control life. They work when we are naturally curious about the nature of life, not necessarily in order for the end of suffering to be there, but just because I'm curious about life. It doesn't matter what the outcome is, I'm just interested in understanding life, interested in understanding who I am. So it's a good point.
But then again, if I'm not interested, it's not my doing.
That's right. That's why what I said is not a judgment of, it's really just a description of the different makeup of people at different times. So earnestness is a word that Nisargadatta used to use, and he'd say all that is needed is earnestness. And earnestness isn't a personal attribute. So he's not saying you need to be earnest, you have to do earnestness. He's saying there either is earnestness or there isn't earnestness, depending on how life has developed you up to a certain point. If there isn't earnestness, meaning if someone isn't really interested, then the change isn't going to happen because the earnestness isn't there. It may be there in 5 years' time. And then you can say, oh, now the earnestness is there and the change will happen. And really the earnestness isn't something that someone achieves. It's just a natural progression that's either there or it's not.
But you pointing this out could also lead to a contemplation within oneself that results in, let's say, earnestness.
Let's hope that's the only reason we talk about it. because the talking is simply part of life that I'm not doing, because that too is part of life. And so the talking is new conditioning that life is delivering. And that new conditioning can then bring about a particular thought. And that thought leads to another thought, leads to another thought, leads to an exploration, leads to a seeing. It's like, how did I not see this before? That, my enemy is functioning the only way they can. In those times where I function and I feel shame about the way I was functioning the only way I can. Not saying it's good. Not saying that is leading to a good result. But I see, regardless of the result, I'm functioning the way I was designed to function. And we either see that or we don't. And hopefully the talking about that, the describing that, can lead to someone seeing it.